It's a little tight, but there is room for everybody. Good morning. My name is David Biette. I'm the director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, one of the co-organizers of this. Last night, in talking to some people, I realized a lot of people don't know what the Woodrow Wilson Centre is, but let me give you a brief introduction. The Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars is the United States memorial to the 28th president. As the other presidents got marble, our only president with a PhD got a research institution. So we are located in Washington, D.C., in the Ronald Reagan building. We have a staff of about 150. We have about 22 programs, of which the Canada Institute is one. And essentially what the Wilson Centre does is knowledge in the public service, and the Canada Institute tries to bring Canada to the attention of policymakers in Washington. This is one of our efforts. The Centre is nonpartisan. We do get some funding from the Congress, so we do not take positions. And we have about 800 meetings a year where we encourage dialogue, like we're encouraging today. It's a busy place with 800 meetings, and we get some pretty big names. Last Friday we had Hamid Karzai, and on Monday we had Tom Friedman. It's not always like that, but it can be a fun place to work. We also have scholars and fellows who come for various periods of time to sit and think big thoughts and write. And if any of you would be interested in corporate sabbatical or coming for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months to work on something, please see me, because we'd love to have a different variety of people than just professors. I'm grateful today to the Canadian Consulate General for hosting us here in Chicago, one of our partners, and to Consul General Georges Rioux for hosting last evening's reception. It was wonderful. I'd also like to thank Susan Evans for her work on the ground here. She's been a great partner. Also our sponsors, Flint Hills Resources, Nexen, Shell, and Suncor. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to do this. I'd also like to thank API for a great breakfast this morning. The talk was good, the food was good, and it was great hearing Representative Chisholm. I'd also like to thank our longstanding partner on these energy forums, this being our 10th, the Canadian Centre for Energy Information. And now I'm going to turn the microphone to Lorraine Royer, who was with Global Public Affairs in Calgary, who is one of our co-organizers, and it's been great working with Lorraine on these and other projects. Lorraine.
Hi, everyone. We have been involved in the CrossBorder Energy Forum since their inception 5 years ago now. Many of us who've been involved from the start can't believe we're on our 10th. They seem to be getting better and better, and we're really proud to be a part of them. These began as one meeting in Calgary, which was a cross-sectoral, cross-border business forum, but we quickly focused on energy. The idea being that dialogue matters, honest and open dialogue among people whose issues meet every day, even if they don't. To meet these people who all have expertise and decision-making capacity in their own right and in their own spheres, much can be learned that will bring understanding and hopefully eventually productive resolution to some of these issues. To accomplish this, the format that we've operated under for the last 9 forums is the format we're going to operate under today. We have asked an interesting and esteemed panel of experts in their own fields and ensured they come from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds to give 10 minutes of perspective. I like to call them thought provokers. Moderated by Patrice Marin-Best, these 5 people will give their perspectives for the first portion of this morning, leading up to the coffee break. This portion will be recorded and later webcast on the Wilson Centre website and the Centre for Energy Information. After the coffee break, we will come back, close the doors, take down the recording equipment, roll up our sleeves, and discuss the perspectives of the panel and your own that you've brought to this topic. This will be a Chatham House Rules, no attribution session that we all agree to by participating here today. We want to encourage open and constructive debate and discussion of the issues. Patrice will also be moderating this discussion. And after this, we will adjourn to lunch, and you will hear more about that later. Just quickly pass the mic to one of our sponsors, Flint Hills, Diane Schmidt.
Hello, thank you so much for coming today. We're so pleased to be a sponsor today Flint Hills, the company I'm here representing, is a refining and chemical business. We have a large facility in Minnesota. We primarily run Canadian crude, so as you can understand, Canada is a major part of our business, and the relationship with Canada is very important to us. We are happy to be here because we think energy future with Canada is very important to us, and we hope a lot to many of you in the room. I'm very pleased today to be introducing Patrice Marin Best. She is back by popular demand. Apparently she has been a moderator in the past and has done a terrific job. She's a veteran of Canadian mining and energy industry. She's capped her day job career as CEO of Luscar Limited, a Canadian's largest thermal coal company. She has championed clean coal technology development. These days she can be found doing consulting or board work. She's a corporate director on the boards of CML Healthcare, a large Toronto Stock Exchange listed company, and New Brunswick Power, which generates electricity from nuclear, coal, hydro, and oil. She's also a member of the board of Alberta Energy Research Institute, which is very close to her heart and mind, and we're very pleased to turn the program over to her and her great moderation skills. Thank you.
Does it sound like we're live from this mic?
Yes?
How about Brent? Can you hear me down there? Great, great. Thank you very much, Diane and Lorraine, for giving us the drill for the day. David, for giving us our little dose of history and appreciation for the patrons and the people who've gone before who provided tremendous leadership in public policy. So that was a great breakfast speech, I thought, from Warren. I thought he touched on the complexity of these issues, the importance of having structure to deal with them, and will. And he certainly did remind us that it takes prosperity to be able to deal with these issues. So our topic today, and I'm always slightly skittish when I see something that says, what is the right choice? Because in my own life, I'm still trying to figure out what right choices are. But what we in this room know are that there are risks, cost, will. It takes science, engineering, and knowledge of impacts to be able to figure out choices. Good choices, better choices, sometimes not perfect choices, but decent choices, respectable choices. And I thought that Warren was very clear in the need for the number of parties who have to come together on that. In our preparatory conference call with the panelists, we had a very lively introduction, and I encouraged our panelists to be forthcoming with their own frank views this morning. So I hope that that indeed will be the case. And because there are so many energy and policy veterans in this room, this is a tough challenge for us. Knowing that the degree of integration and sophistication today's topic requires is enormous. In fact, it is a daunting topic, confusing, confounding, and requires tremendous goodwill underlying it. In both of our countries, we might be experiencing what we call the silly season in Canada. We have a federal election. The United States has a federal election. And we have a variety of headlines in Canada that have just been all over the map relating to this issue. Things like, we have one party that has in fact proposed pretty much an environmental platform as its prime policy document. So who will pay for the green shift? You. Carbon tariffs could boost inflation, say in economists. Green shift, an initiative to save the world, or a new age religion. Running out of time on carbon emissions. Carbon taxes come back to haunt BC Liberals, who now what their polling shows the majority do not want to pay a tax, nor do they believe they'll ever get their money back. And then this week's headline, first U.S. CO2 auction takes in $39 million. So the public, it is a wide spectrum of opinion, view, policy, a bit of a patchwork quilt. And as Warren said, it takes wealth and prosperity to deal with the environment. So panelists, we're counting on you to help us understand and grapple with the question of the day. Carbon standards. What is the right choice, or may I say a good choice, less perfect choice, a reasonable choice for the United States and Canada? And we're going to kick off with Greg Stringham to my left. Greg.
Thank you very much. It's Greg Stringham. Lorraine promised she'd get a marker, so yeah, don't worry about it. I'm pleased to be here. I've been here at a number of the forums that Woodrow Wilson has put on, and it has been a great privilege of mine to be able to today set the context for a little bit of the discussion from the Canadian petroleum producers' perspective. And I think it will kind of set the frame for what's going on and where we're looking at the whole issue of carbon dioxide in total, and how it fits most particularly in this discussion, in my view, in the cross-border discussions that are happening and the potential carbon policies that will be coming out of both sides of the border over the next few months and or years. So let me just start right off by putting the context there. And again, I want to start with context, let you know what we're doing in Canada, and then end up with a little bit of the principles that we are using in the association to look at the carbon policy standard without getting down to exactly what that standard should be. And then we'll come back and have the discussion. One of the main reasons that we're here in this room and talking about carbon standards on the Canadian side of the border is because our future is moving into heavier petroleum fuels. As you can see from this chart, there's 173 billion barrels of oil. Now, Warren referred to the in place. I'm referring to the recoverable number. But to put it in context, there's about 400 years worth of production at today's level of production that is going to come out of the oil sands going forward. The question is, how do we best deal with that as it pertains to carbon standards and as it pertains to cross-border trade? You can see that there is a significant shift from the conventional oil business into what the oil sands are going to be, and it is a lifeblood for not only the economy in Alberta, but it is spreading across the economy in Canada. And as John will refer to, and as we see very heavily, it also is spreading across the economy in the United States as we buy materials and supplies that go into reinforcing the growth that is behind this. So how do we measure the two, I think, pillars of what needs to be discussed today are the economic growth potential that comes out of these fuels, along with the environmental protection that is vastly required to be able to achieve that. Let me put in the context of the Midwest. I think it's quite actually appropriate that we're sitting here in Chicago talking about this issue. Because when I boil this down to the Midwest, you can see that right now the Midwest is the largest consumer of oil that is coming out of Canada, if you look at by region. And if you look at just the imports into this area, I know there is domestic production, you can see that almost 3/4 of that ends up coming out of Canada. Now today that comes down several pipelines, and it's a mixture of light and heavy oils, and it's a number of other things. But as we see our supply shift changing, you're also starting to see investments being done here in the Midwest that are to reflect that supply. And that's the critical, I think, cross-border nature that we need to look at. The biggest question mark, and the only reason the question marks are there is because we did surveys and didn't get all the survey responses back, in Pad 3 down in Houston, as Warren referred to, is that there is a substantial potential growth for that oil to be moving down into refineries there that can handle that kind of oil already. So we need to get this issue of carbon policy and carbon standards correct across both sides of the border, and especially for things moving across the border, to be able to ensure that there is a clear understanding for these decisions to be made as we go forward. Let me jump back now as from a focal basis and look at the world. I think that when we're starting to talk about carbon standards and carbon in particular, we need to take a global perspective. This is a global issue. This is not like air quality with NOx and SOx and volatile organic carbons, which are more a smog and local regional issue. This is a global issue. So if we look at it that perspective, let's look at Canada in the perspective of the world in the top chart. And you can see that Canada makes up 2% of the entire world's emissions of carbon dioxide. Now you may say, well, that's really small, but let me come back and tell you why I'm putting it in that context. Let's take that 2% in the bottom chart and split it up amongst the different sectors. And you can see that the oil sands, and it barely pulls out, and I know that I'm sitting back here and my eyesight can't grab it, but the bottom chart shows oil sands at about 5% of Canada's emissions of that 2%. Let me do the math for you, it's on the bottom. That means that the oil sands right now generate 0.1% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. But I can guarantee it is getting far more attention for that. And I can tell you why. Because as you look at our industry's perspective, there are some huge advantages because the oil sands is a potential growth area. And we can stem some of the carbon emissions coming from that growth by attitudes and behaviors that we could take on as an industry. But more important than that, if we can find a solution that works in the oil sands, it can then be distributed to those other sectors within Canada, but probably most importantly from a global perspective, that technology or that solution can then be portrayed to the other 98% of the world. There is a great opportunity on behalf of our industry to be able to find some technical solutions that will not only work for the oil sands, which is growing, but will also work for things like coal-fired plants in China and in India and other places around the world that will then have a meaningful impact on global emissions for all of us. So let me just put a context around what we are doing in Canada. Number one, Alberta government has passed a law now that requires a mandatory reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. It happened a year ago, July 1st, 2007, which requires a 12% reduction in emissions intensity. And I understand its intensity, we can have that debate. But it also has put a minimum floor price on carbon to say if you can't meet that, you must buy or pay $15 per ton of CO2 into a levy that goes into a technology fund. And I think this is one of the key principles I want to lay on the table for discussion, is that technology fund then is used by the government to invest in technologies that will actually solve the root cause of climate change emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Although it hasn't been spent on everything yet, it does provide an ongoing set of funding that is dedicated to solving the root cause, not then distributed through tax relief and other things, as we'll talk about when we get into carbon tax models or cap and trade models and other things that go with it. The second thing that they've done, besides putting the legislation in place, is they've invested $4 billion of their surplus. As Warren mentioned earlier, Texas has a surplus from its oil prices, so does Alberta. They came out and said, we know that there's two legs to this stool. There's the production side that we need to focus on, and so they put $2 billion of money towards carbon capture and sequestration, but they also said there's also the consumption side we need to focus on, and put $2 billion towards public transit to deal with the consumption side of the issue. Now, the federal government has a policy out there that is actually a little higher in threshold and a little higher in cost, but similar in concept to what Alberta has already legislated. And we await the results of the federal election to see how this policy then gets converted into legislation, but it seems to be heading down the same road. Slightly higher targets, so 18% rising every year after that, and it looks at a price that starts off at $15 but moves up to 20, 23, 24, and then increases with inflation. So it does put a price on carbon. But again, there are some standards that have to meet natural gas equivalency and carbon capture equivalency. You heard Patrice talk about the BC government, one of the provinces, who has put in a carbon tax. And they're playing on the other end of the spectrum as to what that might do, and we can talk about that in detail. But just to give you a flavor of what's been put in place in Canada related to this, that's the context. The other principle that I want to talk about is the principle of how do we evaluate this. I think it's really critical that we take a look at carbon emissions from a complete life cycle or a full cycle or a wells to wheels, whatever you want to call it, perspective. So that when you're comparing, and this is just comparing different locations of crude oil and qualities of crude oil around the world, that you look at the entire life cycle emissions from production and transportation through to the refining and the byproducts from that refining, and also into the consumption from you and I driving our cars or burning it in our furnaces. And when you look at that, you can then make fair comparisons across the board as to what you want to do and how these policies would apply. I suggest to you that that might be still a little bit narrow as you go forward. One of the principles here is looking at the life cycle, but you also have to look at the entire gamut of hydrocarbon production from a single area. As I understand the California local carbon fuel standards, and we've got an expert here to give us more detail on it, it actually looks at combining all of California's domestic statewide crude oils, from their heaviest ones that look like heavy oil and oil sands to their lightest ones, into a common average, and saying here is the average that comes out of that blend. If we did, and I'll put this out as thought-provoking, took all of the natural gas that comes from Canada into the United States, along with all of the oil and heavy oil that comes from Canada, and looked at it as one hydrocarbon source the way they are in California, you would have a much different perspective on this life cycle emissions than you do by looking at only one component. So the broader the component that you look at, the more accurate worldwide solution that you end up coming at. Now, this is not meant to shift the focus from that little green strip on the top that we producers must reduce. Because when we produce heavy oil, it takes more energy, it produces more CO2, but it also takes it out of the synthetic crude oil that comes down, so it's a lighter oil and it doesn't have the carbon in it. So we need to look at all of that, otherwise you may actually drive answers that may seem sectorally specific correct, but overall generate more greenhouse gas emissions. The last one that I want to talk on, have I seen the two from you yet, Lorraine? Not yet, okay. I've been talking way too fast. The last one I want to talk about is the principles that we use for this, and it's to set the context for this discussion. First off, one of the principles that we start with is we need to have government policies that are clear and realistic as we go forward. Now, I'm not looking for some certainty that is unexpected from governments. I know that you can't say, well, gee, we want to know forever what it's going to be, but we need to know that there's a predictable cost to be able to evaluate how this is done. This will influence investment decisions. There's investments that are being made in the oil sands today where projects cost up to $10 billion, and they need to know the rules. But there's also investments being made down here in the Midwest on refineries of $3 billion, and they need to know what those rules are going to be and how it's going to be perceived cross-border. Secondly, we need to look at the non-discriminatory treatment across industries. If we're going to have a set of rules, let's make sure that it applies to everyone equally. The third one that I think is really critical is maintaining international competitiveness. As I said, you want to look at global climate change in the sense of the globe, not just in one domestic area. And so you don't want to set rules in one jurisdiction, state, province, region, territory, and or country that would actually drive that production to go to some other state, region, country, and would not then end up resulting in a net gain for the planet, but rather just a net gain for that region. So that's really critical as far as competitiveness. And the last one is, I think, a fundamental principle that we look at when we're looking at carbon standards, however they may be. And I want to be very careful. I've seen as we started to look in carbon policies now, that whether you're looking at cap and trade, whether you're looking at carbon tax, whether you're looking at low carbon fuel to standards, really those are all different forms of the same kind of policy. And you can actually look at the semantics underneath each of those policies, and they can start to look a lot alike. There's a few differences, but they can actually be very, very similar. And one of the fundamental principles of all of those that we carry into any of those discussions is the central role of new technology in managing these emissions. We've got to come up with new technologies that then can be applied globally and can actually help enable the lower reductions that are going forward. You may have seen in some of the Canadians that are here in the newspaper just a week ago where David Keith at the University of Calgary has come up with a new carbon dioxide technology that removes carbon dioxide from the air that eventually, in his mind, could be applied to the tailpipes and or everything else that's out there. Yes, it's energy intensive and it's an idea, it's there, but those types of ideas and technologies are the breakthroughs that are going to enable us to deal with this global challenge. Other things like lowering temperatures that are going into the extraction of oils can actually be technologies that enable all of this. John's going to talk about one just on the mining trucks that go into the oil sands and enabling the efficiencies there that can actually increase this. When I come to look at the platforms, as I started with, of economic development and environmental protection, the marriage of those two come together with technology. And that's where I think the fundamental principle we have for discussing carbon standards. So let me end with that and turn it over to John.
Great, thank you. Is this on? Pleasure to be here this morning. John Disharoon with Caterpillar. And what I'd like to do is kind of start off talking about the economic impact of the oil sands in Canada, and then kind of get into the carbon standards towards the end. But for the United States, Canada is our largest trading partner, and the same holds true for Caterpillar. We've got our largest fleet of 797 mining trucks in the world operating in the oil sands today. And the market has a tendency to pick the technology that they want, or that they find the most efficient, to harvest the natural resources, and the Caterpillar mechanical drive truck has been the product of choice, not just for this area of the world, but for a lot of our mining customers around the world. It's important to recognize that when we sell a mining truck to Canada, or we sell mining equipment to Canada, the impact that it has right here in the state of Illinois, and Doug knows these numbers pretty well, but the mining truck is manufactured in Decatur, Illinois, wheel loaders, hydraulic excavators, Aurora, Illinois, the track-type tractors, Peoria, Illinois, the transmission for the mining truck, East Peoria, Illinois, the engine for that truck in Lafayette, Indiana. While Caterpillar is a global supplier to the manufacturing industry and the global mining industry, and we have manufacturing facilities in more than 100 countries, all of our big stuff, and these mining trucks are to the extent that as a 6-foot guy, I can reach up and not hit the top lug nut of the wheel on the mining truck, let alone the cab that sits 3 stories off the ground. All of our big stuff is manufactured in Illinois, and we export that around the world. It's assembled on site. While the state of Illinois economy has been a little bit less than enthralling for the past couple of years, Caterpillar has actually added several thousand jobs. Those are manufacturing jobs, high-paying jobs that pay $60,000 to $80,000, $90,000 a year, marketing, manufacturing, technician jobs, support jobs. The economy is very strong in the Caterpillar communities where we operate. So there's a tremendous benefit to the state of Illinois just in the extraction. And that doesn't getting into building the pipelines, maintaining the pipelines, purifying the oil, cracking the oil as it comes down to refineries here in Chicago. That's just on the extraction side. So a huge impact. Since the mining industry is so strong globally and commodity prices are so high, Caterpillar announced this year that we're going to invest $1 billion into our 3 major manufacturing arenas here in the state of Illinois. We're not leaving the state. We're not laying people off. We're actually increasing our investment. We're spending a couple $1 million a day in research and technology to make sure that our cutting-edge technology remains on the cutting edge and that we're performing and providing sustainable solutions to our customers. When you take the mechanical drive 797 that's operating in the oil sands today, the rough underfoot conditions, depending on the temperature up there, frankly, frozen ground is easier to operate in. But you get the slushy, surly underground. It's the Caterpillar technology. Actually, it's the hardening technology, the heat treat of our gears, and the mechanical transmission that allow to propel that truck through the sands to carry its 450-ton load to the processors. Without that technology of CAT, those transmissions would tear up or the truck would spin and you'd blow a transmission, a final drive, and an engine. We've got the only technology out there that allows that to happen. So the question is, if you're going to harvest the natural resources, you want to do it in the most efficient manner possible. And the Caterpillar mining system has proven to be very successful in that endeavor. Now, we're not dumb, fat, and happy, recognizing that there's no externalities to harvesting the oil sands. There is a CO2 footprint, there's a water component, but the fact of the matter remains that the demand for energy continues to climb. That demand curve is going like this. The scientists tell us that the emission curve's got to go like that. So how do you fill that gap? The energy demand is not going away. The U.S. consumes more energy today than they did yesterday. The world, including China and India, other developing worlds, consumes more energy today than they did yesterday. And we think they're going to consume more energy tomorrow. So while we build this path for alternative technologies and more renewable fuels, we still need to have a consistent, reliable, steady supply of energy to feed our economy and feed the economies of the world. And that means you have to go where the energy is. And for the United States, it's proven to be in the oil sands for a good portion of our oil anyway. So we want to help harvest that in the most sustainable manner possible. While we're working on technology, our next version of the mining truck will have a more efficient engine. We'll be able to get more of a payload on there. We'll get more haulage per horsepower of the engine. So it's a more efficient system than we've got today because our customers are now asking us, not just for a bigger truck, but a truck that has fewer emissions. While we're working on greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions from our trucks, you got to remember the regulatory environment that we're in today that requires near zero emissions of PM, NOx, and SOx, particulate matter, black carbon. The technology path to low criterion pollutants, is defined by the Clean Air Act, is a different technology path than low CO2. So the regulatory bodies have already told us you've got to get to near zero on PM, NOx, and SOx, and now we're anticipating we're going to have to be much lower on CO2 as well. But the more you bolt on to the engine to reduce PM, NOx, and SOx, the less efficiency you have in that power plant. That's just a fact of physics. Now, we're trying to figure that out. We've got some very smart people doing it, and we're making inroads to it. But you've got to take all of this in the context of the global economy and the demand for energy. We support nuclear, clean coal, natural gas, renewables, wind, photovoltaic, you name it. We think there ought to be a big mix out there. But we've yet to see a technology yet that can replace the fossil fuel-based technology that we have today. Someday we may have that. It might even come in my lifetime. But in the meantime, our customers demand products that will meet the demands to serve their markets, and we step up to the challenge to do it for them. When it comes to carbon standards, you may all be aware that Caterpillar was one of the very few global industrial companies headquartered in the United States to step up and call for the federal government to enact greenhouse gas regulations through the United States Climate Action Partnership. We did that for a couple of reasons. One, we saw the proliferation of state and regional initiatives, and we think a 50-state hodgepodge of regulations isn't going to help anybody, particularly a global player like us, let alone our customers. But we did so with the indication and the demand that the U.S. step up international negotiations and interaction with the rest of the world. Europe and the other Kyoto Protocol countries think the U.S. took a pass over the last 7 to 10 years, when in fact we've actually been investing in research and technology. But without the Chinas and the Indias of the world, as well as the Kyoto Protocol countries, Canada, Australia, and the rest of them, you're never going to solve a global problem. California passing a climate bill is going to have very little impact on the environment of the United States. It might have an impact on California and their manufacturers and their consumers, but I guess they're not too worried about that. But if California passes a bill and the rest of the United States and the rest of the world doesn't, the net environment doesn't change. In fact, if the United States passes a bill and the rest of the world doesn't do anything, all those winds from Asia are going to come into our atmosphere because CO2 doesn't know a zip code. So it's important that we have international engagement, and I think the U.S. is about the only leader that can step up and hold those negotiations. China didn't come to the meeting that Europe called, but they came to the meeting that the United States called. We've got a lot of work to do, and we know there's challenges, but as a technology company and an energy company and a global manufacturing company, we think we have a role to play, and we're prepared to do so. And I look forward to some engagement after this.
Could I have my slides up, please? Those are Kathy's.
Yeah, he's getting
Do I have another minute?
Well, I think it's just great because it's true to hear CAT refer to itself as a technology company, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there are more computer chips on our large mining trucks that go to the oil sands than there were in the moonshot. We spend $5 million a day, every day, 365 days a year, on research and technology to enable our products to communicate with themselves, with the dealers and the customer, to have this most efficient operating system out there. And that's a fact that I just don't think a lot of people recognize.
We might give you a chance to repeat that again. That was very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
So, I'm Stephen Holland from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I've been asked to give the academic perspective on carbon standards. Since I don't know exactly what that academic perspective would be, I'm going to be talking about some of my work on California's low carbon fuel standard. John's absolutely right. The world can't act without some kind of leadership, and that leadership's probably going to have to come from the U.S. And unfortunately, the U.S. hasn't been taking much leadership on this, and so it's been left up to the states. And one of the states that has tried to do some things has been California. So it's really important for us to take a look at what...
Excuse me, Stephen, 1 minute. Someone may have a BlackBerry near something electronic. So if they do, yours is kind of far, Diane, but anyway, if someone does have a BlackBerry near it, that is what is causing that sort of mischief in the line. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was saying that the state that's been taking the brunt of the leadership role here has been California, and that's why we're going to be talking a bit about California now.
just on the right arrow.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so one of the suite of policies that California introduced was something called the low carbon fuel standard. And I'm posing a question, is this a clever solution to a very difficult problem? We know that this is a hard problem, and Governor Schwarzenegger in particular has been looking for interesting new policies that will make carbon reduction sexy, I guess, is what he wants to do. Kind of like weightlifting used to be just sweaty, grimy work, and now it's sexy. He thinks that maybe carbon policy can become the same way. So what's wrong with the usual policies? What's wrong with, say, a carbon tax? We at least we economists and people in this room understand what a carbon tax would do. Well, the problem is that nobody likes taxes. Taxes are almost a four-letter word in some sense. And the other solution that we have is cap and trade. Well, there's also huge problems with cap and trade. There's debates about how are we actually going to allocate the cap? How are we going to enforce these allocations once we've done this? And also there's this problem of there's a lot of price variation. We saw in Europe that as the permits were nearing expiration, their price plummeted. And we don't know how... Firms can't make investments in new technologies unless they have some certainty about prices. So that brings us back to the low carbon fuel standard as a potential third policy that could help with the problem of carbon. So what does the low carbon fuel standard do? The low carbon fuel standard regulates the average carbon intensity of fuels. Now this was going to be applied on originally in California, but it was hoped that it would be extended at least to a national level. Actually, both McCain and Obama were supporting a national low-carbon fuel standard. So they're actually not that. I don't. Unlike Representative Chisholm, I don't think that McCain and Obama are that far apart on carbon policy, at least relative to where people were in the past. So how are we going to regulate this carbon intensity under a low-carbon fuel standard? We'd be looking at the life cycle assessment of these. So this is really where life cycle assessment got started, looking at the entire life cycle of the product and adding up the emissions rate. So for example, the crude made from tar sands is going to have a much higher emissions rate than standard crude coming from Texas. All right, so this seems like a good idea, right? Well, what's wrong with this low-carbon fuel standard? The problem is that there are three ways that industry is going to respond to a low-carbon fuel standard. Two of them are good, and one of them is bad, right? So the two that are good is they could, first of all, reduce carbon emissions intensities. That's a good thing. But they could also just simply decrease production of high-carbon fuels. That would certainly be a good thing if our target is to reduce carbon emissions. The problem is, in the second point, that one way of lowering the average is to increase production of anything below the average. So I think people were thinking of ethanol as being something that had lower than average carbon emissions. So they could simply meet the low carbon fuel standard by increasing production of ethanol. What would that do to overall carbon emissions? That could potentially increase them. So in some of our work, we made this point that a low carbon fuel standard could actually have the counterintuitive impact of increasing carbon emissions. So there's this problem with what the low carbon fuel standard does, and then there's this problem with what the low carbon fuel standard does not do. It does not encourage such things as carpooling, reduced driving, higher fuel efficiency of cars, things like this. These are the surest fire way to reduce carbon emissions, is to just not use gasoline. Now, we know that that's going to be costly, that we know that people aren't going to like that, but that's the most sure way to reduce carbon emissions. With some of my co-authors, I've argued that we compared the low carbon fuel standard to policies that we know are efficient, like carbon tax or cap and trade. And we argue in that paper that kind of no matter how you parameterize these different models, a low carbon fuel standard comes out approximately 5 times more costly than a cap and trade or a carbon tax. There are other problems that I'm not even pointing out, and most of these problems actually come into play with with cap and trade or a tax. These aren't specific to a low carbon fuel standard, but there are a lot of other problems. Okay, so that leaves us to the question of what's the right choice. And so I guess I'm arguing that a low carbon fuel standard is not the right choice. A footnote, unless it's actually coupled with a gas tax. That could correct it. But if you're going to implement a gas tax, why not go ahead and just have it be a carbon tax? Carbon tax and cap and trade are good solutions, as we know. There's many questions about designing these. Environmental advocacy groups seem to want cap and trade because they'd rather be arguing for a tighter cap than for a higher tax. But there are some advantages to taxes over cap and trade. All these are questions. How are we going to enforce whatever we come up with? What about spillovers? And then, of course, the big question, what about China and India and some of these other problems? And I'll just close with a couple of other good ideas. First thing, just start now. We could start with a modest carbon tax now. We could actually begin to move our tax base toward revenue collection from something that, there's lots of good reasons for a carbon tax. And it would move our tax base to something that it helps with problems rather than causing additional distortions. And if we start with a modest tax now, maybe we can use that to build on later. We also need to think a lot about uncertainty. What would we do if in the unlikely event that climate change suddenly began to get very serious, are there some potential other routes that we could take besides the standard sequestration and tax and trade issues that we've been talking about? I'll close there.
I think I have slides also that someone will bring up. While they're doing that, I did want to just say, as with my esteemed colleagues, thank you for having the Western States Petroleum Association at this event. We're very excited to be here. It's been really nice to strike up a relationship with our Canadian friends, and certainly with some other folks like Flint Hill and Suncor and of course our own members, ConocoPhillips and Shell and ExxonMobil and BP, who are very obviously interested in this topic. But I would like to bring greetings from that crazy state, California, of 35 million people to be 45 million in the next 12 years. So it's a big state, and it has an interesting governor. It's always interesting when your governor is the Terminator. That just brings a whole different perspective to politics in California, I can tell you. But it has helped, I think, in his star appeal in his leadership role. He certainly has taken that role in California. He certainly has taken it in the U.S., and he certainly has taken it internationally. So what is the right choice? And I think you've heard there really isn't a single right choice. There is no silver bullet. There is going to be lots of different menus of choices that are going to solve this problem, and it is a very important problem to solve. But I wanted to tee up some of the challenges and opportunities that we see in this area, and certainly with California's role in this topic, there certainly are both challenges and opportunities. But I think the three things we focus on is adequacy, reliability, and affordability. And I do want to talk a little bit about the affordability. And in our opinion, you have to have all three of those to sustain the future of this issue and being able to solve it over time. And I'll get into that a little more detail. So there we have the infamous AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and 1990 levels by 2020, which is 30% reduction. Other folks have very similar, if not identical, goals in mind. And then the one that really is a challenge for us is an 80% reduction out to 2050, which is a huge, huge task for us to come up with a program to achieve those kinds of reductions. And in the governor's view, the low carbon fuel standard, which is something that was not originally in AB 32, it was something the governor looked at as transportation fuels are about 40% of the emissions in California. He felt it was important that something like the low carbon fuel standard be initiated. But it in itself is a very big challenge. It is to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel 10% by 2020. And that's 10% of carbon intensity. So you take gasoline and diesel, you figure out what its intensity is, and you try to find anything else that's 10% less carbon intensive. And you look at all the alternative and renewable fuels that might fall into that category, and hopefully there is one, and hopefully that'll help you transform your fuels to be able to meet this requirement. You can already understand with listening to some of the previous discussions that in and of itself is a huge challenge, because there isn't anything yet that you can transform your fuel with to meet that requirement. So we've got the Air Resources Board, who is charged with this plan. We have the Energy Commission, who's charged with trying to figure out how the energy plan marries up with the climate change plan, and I can tell you right now that they don't. We're very concerned that you have to have these plans marry up if you're going to be successful. And we have a really good climate change plan, but we do not have an energy plan to support it. So when we talk about adequacy, reliability, and affordability, those two arrows have to come together. And that's the dialogue that has to take place. And it not only has to take place in California, it has to take place in the U.S. and certainly internationally. And this forum, in particular with the relationship with Canada, is extremely key to that equation. And what we found when we talked to the consumers, we did a lot of polling with the consumers, and what we found is that they are very nervous. They certainly support any work on climate change. They understand it's an important problem and it's meritorious that we're all working on it. The minute they understand the costs associated with the program, they get extremely nervous. They do have no confidence that the government will estimate the costs appropriately. They think they will underestimate the costs. And they also have full confidence that they will pay for it, that it will not be anyone else who pays for it. It will be the consumers who pay for it. So that's why they're extremely nervous. They're nervous in their own lives right now, and they want to make sure no matter what we do on this program that they can heat and cool their homes, drive from A to B, and turn their lights on. And they're not convinced that they can do that with this plan. So we are very concerned about the low carbon fuel standard, mostly because of our ability to comply with it, and that's why there's some really important things that have to happen. We wrote a letter to the governor. These are the points in that letter. We're meeting tomorrow with the Air Resources Board in particular at the administration's request to go over these elements. And the most important is that they haven't done the life cycle analysis that Steve referenced. They haven't looked at these alternative pathways in any detail yet to be able to determine which pathway we might be able to go down. That's why this particular standard is being moved till March of '09 instead of November of this year, when AB 32's, what they call the scoping plan, will be adopted. So all of the other measures for climate change in California get adopted in November, but the low carbon fuel standard will move out to March until they finish this analysis, and that is absolutely key. You can imagine putting a standard in place when there isn't anything yet that can help you achieve it. So it becomes really important. I think all of you are familiar with many of these principles, but cost effectiveness, technological feasibility, we think you have to do a multimedia assessment on all the alternative and renewable fuels that we're talking about if you're going to do this right, and you have to consider the fuel supply impacts. Diesel is not getting a fair treatment in this program. It's an excellent fuel from a climate change perspective. It also has a 10% intensity reduction requirement, as does gasoline. Our push was to put that out in the years ahead and allow the program to build upon itself in the early years and allow diesel to help us comply with that. But that isn't the course that they're taking. This is what we think success looks like. These are the things that we tell the governor, that if he wants to increase his chance of success for this program, this is what needs to happen. That first bullet is what we're doing today, and it needs to happen more and more and more. The dialogue that has to occur is not happening, and these forums become very, very important, which is why we are so pleased to be here. The last one I think is really important on the harmonization. I think you heard both Greg and John talk about this, that no matter what you do as a state or what you do as a region, harmonizing federally and internationally is absolutely key. So we keep these first and foremost in our back pocket when we're talking to anyone on this issue, and it's certainly at every opportunity. These are the types of things we really hammer home with the media in particular. And I think you heard John mention this. This is the forecast for the future, and when you look at it, 80% of it's petroleum, and that's out to 2030. And you can't ignore this. You can't put a plan in place that says this isn't reality, because this is reality. And so when you take your energy plan and your climate change plan, you've got to overlay this on it and have a serious discussion. Renewables may grow 30% from 300% from 2005, but they're still a small piece of the puzzle, even out to 2030. That just gives you perspective of where every one of our states, those are all of our 6 states that we represent, plus Canada, plus the U.S. versus the world. And that's an important chart to remind ourselves that no matter what we do individually, it is that harmonization worldwide that's going to solve this problem. I'm not going to go into the WCI, but as you all know, the Western Climate Initiative is what's putting together the Market Cap and Trade Program. Canada is certainly part of that. And they came out with their proposal last week, some of which we like, some of which we don't, but a lot more work to be done, and we can certainly talk about the specifics of that plan as we get into this. Obviously, our relationship with Canada is absolutely key when it comes to oil sands. I'm not going to go over that. We had previous speakers touch on that, and that's why. Whether you look at the barrel picture that we saw or this picture, Canada's a big player and certainly very important to the U.S. And here's the big question. What is this going to cost? The Air Resources Board painted a pretty rosy picture in the scoping plan. It's basically not going to cost anything. In fact, they believe the low carbon fuel standard is achievable and that it's actually not going to cost the consumers. I have no idea how they can come up with this in this complex program. We believe the costs are very substantial. Here's some of the economists that are beginning to look at this and think it is also very underestimated. And we can talk in some more detail about what goes behind the assumptions in here, but the energy assumptions we think are pretty, need serious updating. But according to this, it's all good. It's going to generate jobs, the economy's going to boom, and it's going to be the best thing we've ever done. So here's the big challenge. This is my communications guy. He gets creative every once in a while. Yeah. But we have competing policies. We've got reduction of petroleum dependence, energy independence, limiting access to resources, and trying to lower climate change emissions while we have demand on the increase, while we have technology that's not available yet in time to diversify, and consumers who absolutely require affordable, reliable fuel every day. And so here's how we think you can maybe enhance your chance of success, a lot of those principles you saw earlier. But if you do this thoughtfully and you do this openly and transparently with compliance pathways that make sense and are justified scientifically, we think some of these goals, at least you have a chance of achieving them. If you don't follow those very core principles, we think the chance of success is pretty limited. And that's the bridge we look at. I mean, California is on a bridge to the future. We're not sure what it looks like. We're concerned that they don't have the engineering plans and building blocks in place yet to get to the other side. But we're working with them every day to try to do that. And we'll see what Friday brings. That's the release of the scoping plan. That's California's plan. I think lots of folks will be looking at that in this room in particular as well. And that will start to chart the course for what we all will look out to how to solve the climate change issue. So again, thank you very much for allowing us to participate.
Good morning. I'm going to stand up because I'm going to make some notes. I guess this is the wrap-up piece because virtually everything I've said or was going to say has already been mentioned. So I'll just tie it all together, or try to. And I'll start out by saying that we're going to move from the logical to the illogical because we're going to move from substance to politics now. And what I'm going to do is try to give you in a very few minutes what's going on. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me here today, and I also want to pay particular attention to my old friend, Gary Marr. Gary and I ran into each other last night, and I can say after more than 2 decades of time in the states and provinces, I've never run into, worked with, dealt with a public official that was more well-reasoned and studied than Minister Gary Marr. And so it's a pleasure to see you again. And after 10 years, I'm glad you recognize me with no hair. We are in the middle of a very complex, sophisticated campaign on carbon. And I started in this area in the mid-'80s with a young United States senator who was then opining on the issue, Al Gore. And it's an issue that I've been involved with now for more than 2 decades. And for me, having seen this thing unravel, I've not seen this kind of sophisticated, multi-stakeholder, multi-forum initiative since the 80s when we were first dealing with industry and early passage of RCRA and state solid and hazardous waste acts. The environmentalists have beat the drum, and they have beat many of us to the plate on issues that are profound, not only to our businesses, but to our families and our communities. And the way that I would describe it, and I'd like to just draw this diagram if I could, carbon equivalent, is that we see challenges from 4 different forums concurrently. At the same time, we have legislative, regulatory, litigation, and collateral. And if you consider that we're dealing in these 4 areas at the same time, and I'll talk about this a little bit, these 4 areas in 5 different broader jurisdictions, which is international, national, regional, state, and local, we have quite a task ahead of us to bring reason to this issue. And I start where Lorraine started, which is meaningful dialogue. I spend virtually every day of every week out in the States and have for many years on this issue. This week alone, 4 states. I started off in the state of Alabama and then went over to the state of Minnesota today in Illinois and tomorrow in the state of chaos in D.C. There's a lot going on and there's very little understanding. What has driven this carbon debate at its core is global climate change. And in global climate change, a lot of what has been said is not inaccurate, it's just incomplete. And a lot of what we try to do when we deal with communities is not just give them the inconvenient truths, but give them the whole truth. And there's a lot more to be said than has been said. So without being naysayers, you start with, and I think that oftentimes what you see is the graphs that were shown earlier about what California's percentage is, or yesterday in Minnesota, Minnesota's percentage of global greenhouse gas is 0.37%, or I think 157 million metric tons a year. But that's of the contributions that man makes. And few people talk about the anthropogenic interference, or man's contribution to greenhouse gases, being less than 6% of the total. So there's statistics without denying, without being on the sidelines of denying that man's contributions can impact global climatic cycles. There's facts that are out there that are missing, and what I like to tell people is there are gigantic causal relationships that are missing. The way this has been debated in the public through sound bites is that you see these tremendous environmental degradation or circumstances. Myself, having gone down to Antarctica, I've seen pieces of Larsen's ice shelf float past. So I know the kind of images that can leave on people's minds, but they go from that, or Rita, to Katrina, to yes, man is doing this. We are solely responsible, and then so you go from seeing the circumstances to man being responsible to now cap and trade. And if you look at this issue and you go back for the first 10 years, this was largely debated under the banner, the political banner, buzzwords of Kyoto Protocol. And one of the previous speakers spoke about some of the deficiencies in that at the time that it was first enacted, it captured little more than 55% of global emissions. And by today, 10 years later, it captures less than 50%. So these are real issues. And we will not have a real resolution until we have a global resolution. And so one issue that underlies this is if what our leadership position is simply moving emissions from areas of the world that are regulated to the areas of the world that are unregulated, we really haven't addressed the underlying issue. In fact, I'm often asked, because people think I'm a naysayer, and I'm really not, I just try to bring reason to it, what's the cost for inaction? I'd like to ask, what's the cost for the wrong action? Because what I think you've seen over the last 8 or 10 years, with 8 million manufacturing jobs having left this country and gone to places like China, you've actually seen global emissions continue to rise at a meteoric rate. And while the EU would position itself as a tremendous leader in this area by keeping their emissions static, at the same time, if global emissions continue to rise, then really what good have we done? So how is this going to play out? Well, I mean, in 10 minutes, I really can't get into the specifics, but you're going to see developments in the areas that I mentioned. You're going to see, for example, on a national level, both Senator McCain, Senator Obama have supported cap and trade. You're going to see federal legislation. You're going to see regulatory action. EPA has put out a notice of a proposed rulemaking on carbon, where they're going to require carbon quantification and disclosure, which is what I would expect to come out of that is something similar to TRI, where you have to quantify and put it out. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see litigation. Last year, the Supreme Court in Massachusetts versus EPA the court found that carbon was a pollutant that could be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And underneath that, you now see collateral attacks on air permits using Massachusetts case in Georgia, Montana to appeal the award of air permits. So you're going to see additional issues here. You're then going to continue to see more collateral attacks. We talked, Kathy, last night about environmental justice. You're going to begin to see carbon and carbon equivalent factored into that. And all of this is going on at the same time. And very little is going on in the states to help people understand the real issues behind this. There is not a lot of meaningful dialogue. So if you start on a federal level, it's hard to imagine either president during this next administration something not happening with carbon, whether it's a carbon cap and trade, whether it's just regulation of carbon, something is going to happen. You heard probably the most conservative legislator in all 50 states talk about a new carbon caucus, okay? So if Representative Chisholm has created a carbon caucus to initiate ideas on carbon in the state of Texas, then that sort of establishes the right wing. And you can back up from there and imagine what the rest of the states are going to be doing. There are states that have passed. The Climate Change Strategies Group is in 16 states with studies talking about how they can reduce carbon and the other greenhouse gases through a variety of opportunities. And unlike the studied bureaucrats in Canada, I tend to think it's going to cost some. I don't know. I'm out on a limb here, I suppose. But there are other credible studies like the CBO, EPA, NAM, others that find that there are going to be costs. And these issues are going to be debated federal, regional. We know about what's going on in western states. Midwest governors have a plan that's coming out. Reggie initiated last week with their carbon auction. Even the southern state, the Southern Governors Association has now initiated something because the politicians are racing to get out in front of this. There's a lot going on and there's very little dialogue. The bad news is that the challenge is tremendous. And I would hasten to add that if you have constructive communications, don't walk away from the table, because there are people out there committed to this issue that are going to continue to beat it. And if you win here, you may lose here. And this is a very sophisticated model that these environmental groups are using. And they do believe that it's either going to cost nothing or the cost pales in comparison to what it would cost for us to not enact these sorts of initiatives. That's a challenge. The good news is this. We have polled in 24 different states here in the United States, and it found that one of the speakers mentioned earlier, that while people believe there's something to global climate change, and they're very concerned about it, they want somebody else to pay for it. So that when it comes to them and what they're willing to pay for, most of our surveys would show they're willing to pay nothing for it. Some will go $5 a month. And virtually any credible study that's done on electricity and gas on these carbon issues demonstrate that there's tremendous cost. We need credible dialogue. We need third parties outside the industry that'll stand up for us. I know Kathy and the group has done a wonderful job with low-income groups in California. We've worked closely with some of those groups. The Congressional Black Caucus has taken a position on this because low-income groups will be some of the groups hardest hit. We need a coordinated, aggressive strategy to bring reason and put out the whole truth on this issue, or we need to be prepared to lose markets and create tremendous costs in our business. I look forward to talking about this later after the break. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
I'm glad you were on your feet. I don't think your chair legs would have stood having you sitting down. Well, that is food for thought and food for coffee. So we're going to head to coffee, and then we're going to come back. And I don't think it's going to be hard to hold these thoughts in your mind to just get going here when we come back from coffee with a lively exchange. So we'll look forward to that, and thank you all for your attention. And our panelists were fantastic in their presentations, so let's give them a